The Budinilk bell rang at 6 a.m. sharp, causing Jack Donovan to slam the alarm clock irritably. His head was buzzing from the 4 beers he'd knocked back with his co-workers after his shift last night. The familiar hangover, familiar fatigue, habitual life. Jack struggled to get out of bed, casting a frown at the sleeping Linda. Her body, once so desirable, now evoked only indifference. 17 years of marriage had turned passion into a boring chore, displacing romance with domesticity. Sometimes he'd forgotten what she'd been like before life in this backwater of Riverside had sucked the juices out of both of them. Putting on his carefully ironed warden's uniform, the only thing Linda did flawlessly, Jack thought back to when he'd taken the job at Black Hill almost 12 years ago. Back then, the job had seemed temporary until something better came along. But days had added up to months, months to years, and now he was a shift supervisor with a growing beer belly and a mind dulled by routine. Half an hour later, after hastily gulping down his cold coffee and leaving the dishes in the sink let Linda notice and get angry, Jack got into his shabby Ford and went to work. At least here he felt needed, important. Behind the barbed wire of the county jail, he was power, not just another middle-class loser from a working-class neighborhood. Linda Donovan woke up in an empty bed, as usual. The silence of the house pressed down on her harder than the morning light shining through the cheap blinds. 38 years, more than half of them with Jack. Once a high school beauty who dreamed of becoming a nurse, she's now a haggard supermarket cashier at Fred's, with the first gray hair and deep wrinkles around her eyes. Getting out of bed, Linda mechanically began to clean up Jack's scattered belongings. The usual dirty socks next to the bed, a damp towel on the bathroom floor, crumbs on the kitchen table. The same thing every day. She walked over to the sink, finding an unwashed cup. Of course, she thought. Why not wash it yourself? Looking out the window at the gray November sky, Linda suddenly remembered that Jack hadn't brought his lunch with him again. Normally she didn't care. It was his own fault. But today was something special. Maybe fatigue from the routine had reached its limit. Maybe she just wanted to do something unusual, to get out of the house even for an hour. Or maybe the annoying commercials for a new romantic movie on TV reminded her that she was still a woman, even though she hadn't felt like one in a long time. Linda glanced at her watch. She had a shift at the supermarket, but only from 2. Just enough time to drop off Jack's lunch. She opened the refrigerator and started making a sandwich. Spreading mayonnaise on the bread, she caught herself doing it more carefully than usual, as if trying. For who? She grinned. Jack won't even notice. Finished with lunch, Linda made her way to the bathroom. Normally, she didn't try very hard to go to the supermarket, but today, as if by some inner naivety, she pulled out her makeup bag. A little mascara on her lashes, a little lipstick on her lips, her favorite earrings, given by Jack at the best of times. What looked back at her in the mirror was not a tortured middle-aged woman, but a glimpse of the girl she'd once been. It thrilled her strangely. The Black Hill County Jail didn't have the scope of the federal facilities, just an ordinary county jail for petty criminals, with peeling paint on the walls and the constant smell of cheap disinfectant. Jack sat in the warden's room, reviewing the night shift reports. Nothing unusual, 2 fights, 1 stashed homemade knife, the usual routine. The door to the room opened and Tim, the young probation worker, walked in. Donovan, your wife's here to see you. Said she'd brought lunch. Jack frowned. Linda never brought him lunch. She rarely came to the prison at all, considering it to be a gathering place for the dregs of society. Let her wait in the visitor's room, he mumbled, annoyed at the sudden intrusion on his routine. Linda fidgeted nervously with the strap of her bag as she sat in the empty visitor's room. The smell of disinfection and some musty odor made her wrinkle her nose. She was already regretting her impulsive decision. She should have just left lunch at home, or let Jack handle it himself. This place was making her uncomfortable. The door opened and an inmate entered the room with a cart carrying dirty cups and a carafe of water. He was not what she had imagined criminals to look like. Tall, with an athletic build and an unexpectedly attractive face, despite the prickly look in his brown eyes. His uniform had a patch with his number and name on it, Carter. Sorry about the mess, ma'am, he said in an unexpectedly soft voice and began picking up the cups from the table. Linda smiled awkwardly. not knowing if she should answer. "It's okay," she finally said. The prisoner looked at her more carefully, and something akin to approval flashed in his gaze. "Are you expecting a husband?" he asked, continuing his work. "Yes, he's the warden, Jack Donovan." Carter grinned faintly. "I know him. Good man," he said without much conviction. "You must be bored sitting here. There won't be many visitors today. Thursday's not a day for visits." Linda felt a strange excitement, almost forgotten since her school days. A simple conversation with a stranger suddenly seemed like an exciting adventure. "It's all right, I'll wait," she said, trying to sound nonchalant. Vince Carter stayed a little longer than his job required. In his mind, he had long ago noted the ring on the woman's finger, her modest clothes, her desperately concealed insecurity. He'd seen women like this before. Women bogged down in routine, oblivious to themselves, craving attention. In his 30 years, he'd learned to read people better than any book. "You're especially beautiful today, Mrs. Donovan," he said quietly, finishing the cups. "Lucky your husband." Linda blushed, surprised at her own reaction. How long had it been since anyone had complimented her? Jack had long since stopped noticing her as a woman. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly wishing this strange conversation would continue. But at that moment the door opened, and Jack walked in, frowning and unfriendly. "Carter, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be in the kitchen?" he bellowed. "Cleaning up, boss, as you can see," Vince replied calmly, keeping his tone courteous. "I'm on my way." As he passed Linda, he winked at her without Jack realizing it, and the simple movement sent a long-forgotten thrill through her. In the days that followed, Linda often thought of that meeting, about the unfamiliar excitement that the prisoner had aroused in her. How long it had been since she had felt desirable and attractive. Vince Carter had awakened something in her that seemed to have died years ago. She started finding excuses to visit the prison more often. Jack's forgotten keys, some paperwork, or just a desire to check on her husband. Jack, immersed in his own problems and daily routine, hadn't even noticed the change, writing it off as a woman's quirks. Vince did. Every time he met Linda, he found a way to have a word with her, to compliment her, to hold her gaze a little longer than necessary. She knew she was playing with fire, but she couldn't stop. For the first time in years, she felt alive. Once, as she waited for Jack in the visitor's room, Vince discreetly handed her a folded note. "You deserve more than this life," it read. Linda knew she should throw it away, forget this madness, but instead she tucked the note into her pocket like a precious treasure. Spring brought with it not only warm weather, but also new opportunities for encounters. Vince had been assigned to a group of inmates working to beautify the outside of the prison. Through his connections on the outside, former associates he'd once helped avoid prison, he'd arranged a brief meeting with Linda outside Black Hill. It was a risk for both of them. For Vince, extra time for escape. For Linda, the collapse of her reputation and marriage. But neither thought about the consequences. 20 minutes in an abandoned warehouse near the prison grounds was all they had. Linda came in, trembling with fear and excitement. Vince was waiting for her, ridiculous in his prison uniform, but with a look so hungry that her legs gave out. "You came," he said, not hiding his joy. "I was afraid you'd change your mind." "I was afraid too," Linda admitted honestly, feeling her heart pounding. He stepped closer, cautiously, as if afraid to scare her away. His hand touched her cheek, a simple and gentle gesture that Jack had long forgotten. "You're special, Linda," he whispered. "I knew it at first sight." She knew it was a lie. That to someone like Vince, she was just entertainment, a way to brighten his prison days. That he'd probably said those words to dozens of women before her. But now, with his lips so close to hers, that lie was sweeter than any truth. Their kiss was frantic, desperate, full of repressed desire and forbidden passion. Linda gave herself over to the feeling completely, forgetting the reality outside the warehouse, her husband, her normal life. In Vince's arms, she was once again the young girl who believed in love and passion, not routine and frustration. Later, buttoning her blouse with trembling hands, she felt no shame or remorse, only a new painful dependence on this man, on the emotions he awakened in her. I want to see you again, Vince said, adjusting his uniform. I'll organize something better next time. You deserve better than that. Linda only nodded, unable to utter a word. At that moment, she would have agreed to anything to have that feeling again, the feeling that she was alive, that she was a woman, not just a shadow living in the shadow of an unloved husband. As she left the warehouse, she didn't realize that she had just taken the first step on a path that would lead her to inevitable tragedy. All that existed in that moment was those stolen moments of passion and a new, dizzying sense of freedom. Linda woke up in the middle of the night covered in sweat. It was the third night in a row that she had been awakened by a strange fever. Finding a glass of water in the darkness, she drank it down greedily. Jack was snoring beside her, not even noticing her condition. It was to her advantage, though, that his inattention was less of a question. Getting out of bed, Linda wandered to the bathroom. In the dim nightlight, her reflection in the mirror looked haggard. Sunken eyes, a sickly pallor, and those strange spots on her neck that had appeared a few days ago. At first, she'd written them off as allergies from a new cream, but now they'd spread to her chest. The anxiety she'd been trying to suppress for the past few days was rising with renewed vigor. It had been more than 2 months since she'd last seen Vince. 2 weeks ago, he'd unexpectedly passed a note through a mutual acquaintance, a guy who worked in a store near the prison, a former cellmate of Vince's. "Don't come back again, it's better for both of us," it said. No explanation, no contact. It was as if everything that had been between them had been suddenly crossed out with a flick of a hand. Linda went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Thoughts swirled around her condition. The constant fatigue, the night sweats, that strange rash, and then a memory from the past struck her like a thunderbolt. A long time ago, back in college, they'd had a seminar on sexually transmitted diseases. At the time, she'd thought something like this would never touch her life. It only happens to people who lead promiscuous lives, she had naively thought at the time. That morning, barely Jack had left for work. Linda called a clinic in a neighboring town, not in their little riverside, where everyone knew each other by sight, but in Millerton, 40 minutes away. Dr. Rachel Harris listened intently to Linda's complaints, showing neither surprise nor disapproval. In her 50s, she had seen enough human drama to learn to maintain a professional detachment. "I need to take some tests," she said after the examination. "The rash is really uncharacteristic of allergies. Given the other symptoms, it's better to rule out some possibilities." Linda understood the understatement without difficulty. Her throat constricted with fear, but she nodded. As the nurse drew blood, Linda thought about those brief encounters with Vince, about how careless they'd been, about the note he'd passed. Now his sudden disappearance from her life made ominous sense. "The results will be ready in 3 days," Dr. Harris said goodbye. "Try not to worry beforehand." But Linda already knew. Somewhere deep inside, she felt that her life would never be the same. Those 3 days were the most agonizing of Linda's life. She mechanically performed her duties at the supermarket, avoided talking to her neighbors, and lay awake every night listening to Jack's snoring and wondering what would happen next. When the call from the clinic rang, she picked up the phone, pressing the answer button with a trembling hand. Dr. Harris's voice sounded professionally restrained. "Mrs. Donovan, your results are ready. I'd prefer to discuss them in person." "Just tell me," Linda whispered, knowing she couldn't bear another visit. The pause on the other end of the line seemed interminable. "You tested positive for HIV, the doctor finally said. "I'm sorry, but it's not a verdict. There are effective treatments that allow—" Linda didn't listen. Her ears rang in her ears and the room swam before her eyes. HIV, the 3 letters that had crossed out her whole life, 3 letters that were the punishment for a few months of secret happiness. The drive to the prison was a blur. Linda couldn't even remember how she drove, how she parked, how she got through security. All she could think about was Vince, the man she had put her trust in, the man who may have deliberately doomed her to this disease. The visitor's room was half empty, just a few women waiting to see the inmates. Linda had found an excuse, supposedly to deliver important documents to her husband. But she wasn't here to see Jack. She knew that Vince was usually cleaning the visitor's room at this time. 10 minutes later, the door opened and he came in with a cleaning cart. When he saw Linda, he froze, losing his usual self-assurance for a second. You shouldn't have come, he said quietly, looking around. But you have some explaining to do, Linda replied, feeling the anger building up inside, pushing out the fear and despair. Vince stepped closer, pretending to do his job. I have HIV, Vince, she whispered, looking him straight in the eye. And you knew that very well, didn't you? She'd expected denial, surprise, perhaps even sympathy, but not the cold, almost calculating look he cast at her. I'm sorry, he said without much remorse in his voice. But I couldn't tell you. You wouldn't have come to the warehouse then. Linda's breath caught at such a cynical admission. You used me, she said, barely holding back tears, just having fun at my expense. Vince shrugged, and there was more truth in that gesture than in anything he'd said before. I'm a prisoner, baby. I don't have the luxury of being honest. I don't have the luxury of choosing. He was silent for a second and then added, almost regretfully, but I really liked you. That's why I stopped everything as soon as I found out my status on the physical. When did you find out? Linda asked, feeling the desperation building. After we met? Vince looked away, and that was more eloquent than any admission. Before, he said quietly. The week before we met at the warehouse. Linda felt the ground slipping from under her feet. He knew everything, and he'd gone through with it anyway. Willfully put her at risk, thinking only of his own pleasure. I hate you, she whispered, standing up. Get in line, Vince grinned. A lot of people hate me, but you know what? You made your own choice. No one dragged you into that warehouse. There was some truth in what he said, and it made the pain worse. She did make a choice that she would have to pay for the rest of her life. Back home, Linda collapsed on her bed, unable to hold back her sobs any longer. Everything was falling apart. Her health, her marriage, her whole life. Everything was turning to rubble because of one bad decision. She thought about Jack, about telling him the truth, about the reaction of the neighbors when the news spread through their small town, and it was bound to. About her job at the supermarket, which she was likely to lose. Who would want a cashier with HIV? But most of all, she thought about her guilt, about how she had betrayed her husband, even though their marriage had become a joyless routine, about letting a man into her life who had so indifferently destroyed it. Time passed imperceptibly, and soon it was dark. Linda heard Jack's car pull up. Judging by the squeal of brakes and the slamming of the door, he was drunker than usual. Not tonight, she thought with despair. Not now. Jack piled into the house, singing loudly to some song. Friday was his traditional day for drinking with his coworkers. Usually she was already asleep by the time he arrived, avoiding an unpleasant scene. But tonight, she sat in the kitchen, unable to move, unable to think. On the table in front of her lay the envelope with the test results she had picked up from the clinic. Oh, the mistress is awake, Jack exclaimed as he entered the kitchen. He smelled of cheap whiskey. Did you miss your husband? He came over, trying to hug her, but Linda pulled away. Normally, that didn't cause him any questions. He'd long since gotten used to her coldness. But today, something in her eyes made him wary. What's wrong with you? He asked, suddenly serious. Linda was silent, not knowing how to start a conversation. Jack plopped down in the chair across from her and his gaze fell on the envelope. What's this? He asked, holding out his hand. Don't, Linda said quietly, but it was too late. Jack had already opened the envelope and pulled out the results sheet. His eyes, clouded by alcohol, ran slowly over the lines, stopping at the top one, HIV positive. The blood rushed from his face. He looked at the paper, then at Linda, then back at the paper, as if he couldn't believe his eyes. What is it? He repeated, but now there was a threat in his voice. What? This. Jack, I can explain, Linda began, but he interrupted her, slamming his fist down on the table so hard that the cups bounced. Explain? Explain what? That you caught HIV? How the hell could you have gotten HIV when I'm your only partner for the last 17 years? Linda was silent, and that silence was more eloquent than any words. Understanding slowly dawned on Jack's face, replacing bewilderment with rage. You cheated on me. Not a question, but a statement. You fucking cheated on me. Jack, I'm sorry, Linda whispered, unable to find any other words. With who? His voice became quiet, which was scarier than any scream. Who did you sleep with? Linda shook her head, unable to say Vince's name, but that only made Jack even angrier. Answer me! He yelled, jumping up from his chair. Who did you sleep with, you whore? It doesn't matter, she said. It was a mistake, Jack. I didn't know. It doesn't matter? He grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her so hard her teeth clattered. You picked up fucking HIV and you're telling me it doesn't matter? His fingers dug into her shoulders, causing pain. Linda tried to pull away, but his grip only grew tighter. Let go, you're hurting me, she pleaded. Hurt you? Jack laughed a terrible, insane laugh. You don't know what pain is, but I'll show you. He let go of her so abruptly that she fell to the floor. Jack loomed over her, his face contorted with rage and the pain of betrayal. I gave you everything, he gritted through gritted teeth. A home, stability, my goddamn life. And you did what? You went and spread your legs for some bastard who gave you AIDS. It was one of your prisoners, Linda suddenly blurted out, not knowing why she was saying it. Maybe to hurt him more, to get back at him for years of neglect. Jack's eyes widened in shock. What did you say? You heard me? Linda replied, getting up from the floor. A sudden courage filled her. There was nothing left to lose. One of the prisoners, Vince Carter. Jack froze, trying to comprehend what he was hearing. Then his face contorted with a fury like Linda had never seen before. You? With a prisoner in my prison? Each word sounded like a whiplash. Linda stepped back, suddenly afraid of what she had awakened. Jack had never been aggressive, even on his worst days. But now, there stood before her a man who had lost control. Jack, calm down, she said, trying to sound confident. Let's just talk. Talk? He grabbed a heavy glass ashtray off the table. You ruined my life, my career, my health, and you want to talk? Linda saw the madness in his eyes and realized she had to run. She rushed for the door, but Jack was faster. Grabbing her by the hair, he yanked her back with force, making her scream in pain. You're not going anywhere, he growled in her ear. Nowhere. Linda tried to break free, but the grip was too strong. She felt the ashtray in his hand rise to strike, and she clenched her eyes shut, preparing for the pain. It all happened so fast. The sound of shattering glass, Jack's heavy breathing, and the sound of a body falling. And then there was silence, as the sirens of police cars tore through the pre-dawn silence of Riverside. Their shrill howls and flashing lights drew the attention of neighbors who, bundled up in bathrobes, looked out of windows and onto porches. Mrs. Pedersen, an elderly woman who lives across the street from the Donovans, was the first to notice something amiss and called the police when she heard screaming and the sound of breaking glass. Detective Mike Russell was one of the first to arrive on the scene. A 45-year-old man with the shadows of fatigue lingering under his eyes, he methodically got out of his car, lit a cigarette, and looked around. An ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. But today it had become the scene of tragedy. Pulling on latex gloves, he stepped inside, where he was greeted by a young patrol officer with a pale face. First homicide? Russell asked, noticing how he avoided looking toward the kitchen. Yes, sir, the patrolman replied. Victims in the kitchen. Male, stab wound. Russell nodded and headed toward the source of the blood odor his experienced nose had picked up upon entering. The kitchen was chaotic. Overturned chairs, broken dishes, a dark pool of blood on the linoleum. And in the center of it all was the body of a man, with a knife deeply embedded in his chest. Shards of a broken glass ashtray lying nearby. Did you find anyone else in the house? Russell asked, surveying the crime scene. No, sir. The house was empty when we arrived. The front door was open, and there was a trail of blood on the porch, heading toward the street. The detective frowned. A typical domestic homicide didn't usually end in a runaway. The perpetrator either surrendered on his own or stayed put in a state of shock. Russell scrutinized the kitchen, noting signs of a desperate struggle. On the floor, partially soaked with blood, lay a piece of paper. Bending over, he gingerly picked it up with tweezers. A medical report with a positive HIV test result in the name of Linda Donovan. The date of the test was only 3 days ago. Put out a bolo for the victim's wife, he ordered. Check hospitals, bus stations, motels, and find out who Vince Carter is. His name is on the back of this sheet." Bill Walker didn't look pleased to be called in so early. A county pathologist with years of experience, he grunted as he pulled on gloves and prepared for the autopsy. "Well, let's see what happened to you, Jack Donovan," he muttered as he began the procedure. The results were predictable. Death was caused by a penetrating stab wound to the heart area. One precise blow delivered with enough force to penetrate the sternum. The body showed signs of alcohol intoxication. Blood alcohol level was well above normal. There were fresh abrasions on Jack's knuckles, evidence that he had struck someone or something before he died. Under his fingernails, fragments of skin and hair, indicating a struggle. And on the left palm, small cuts, probably from broken glass. "Looks like the guy used his fists before he died," Bill noted, dictating into the microphone, "and apparently broke something glassy, which cut his hand." When Russell came to get the results, Bill had already finished the bulk of the work. "The cause of death is obvious, a penetrating stab wound to the heart," said the pathologist. "But what's more interesting is this. The victim's hands showed signs of struggle, abrasions on the knuckles, cuts from glass, fragments of skin and dark hair under the fingernails, apparently female. Blood alcohol level is twice the legal limit for driving." "What's your guess?" Russell asked. "Apparently, he got into a violent fight before he died. He struck someone with his fist, then probably used a glass object, the shards of which cut his hand. In return, he received one precise stabbing. There was no sign of self-defense. He made no attempt to block the blow, which might indicate that the attack was sudden, or that he was the aggressor himself and didn't expect a fight back." Russell nodded thoughtfully. "Time of death? Between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m., Bill answered. "It's hard to be more precise considering how much time has passed." "Thanks, Bill," said the detective, taking the preliminary report. "Call me if you find anything else." Meanwhile, 50 miles outside of Riverside, in a small roadside motel called the Pine Forest, Linda Donovan sat on the edge of her bed, staring into the void. The cut on her face, hastily treated in the restroom of a roadside cafe, ached. Her hands, still trembling, were clean of blood. She'd rubbed them in the bathroom until the skin was red, but she still felt like they were stained. The picture before her eyes was Jack lying on the kitchen floor, the knife in his chest, the spreading pool of blood, and his eyes, wide open, full of surprise, as if he hadn't believed until the last moment that she could do such a thing. Linda couldn't remember how she'd run out of the house, how she'd gotten into the car, how she'd gotten to that motel. Everything was a blur. Only now, nearly 8 hours later, was reality beginning to emerge through the shock. She had killed a man, her husband. There was a knock on the door, making her flinch. Fear gripped Linda. Had the police already found her? But it was only the receptionist, an older man with tired eyes. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but eviction time has passed," he said. "Are you staying another night?" Linda nodded, holding out crumpled bills from her meager supply of cash. She knew she couldn't stay here much longer. But where to go? What to do next? In her bag was a dead cell phone she was afraid to turn on. A few $100s in cash, all her savings. Papers in the name Linda Donovan, a name that would now be associated with murder. "I had to defend myself," she thought, remembering the fury in Jack's eyes, the pain of being hit with the ashtray, his hands on her hair. "I had no choice." But was that the whole truth? Somewhere deep inside, guilt was stirring. Not for defending herself, but for bringing the situation to this point. Her connection to Vince, her lies, her naivety. It had all led to tragedy. Linda thought again of Vince Carter, the man who, without knowing it, or knowing it, had been the catalyst for the drama. How would he react when he heard the news? Will he blame her? Or would he just laugh at yet another stupid woman who believed his lies? She wanted to talk to him, to explain what had happened, but she knew it was impossible. Not only were the walls of the prison between them now, but Jack's blood as well. Russell spent the next few days gathering information. He interviewed the Donovans' neighbors, who confirmed that quarrels had been heard frequently in their home in recent months. No one had seen any obvious signs of violence, but Mrs. Pedersen had once noticed a bruise on Linda's arm. At the supermarket where Linda worked, her co-workers reported strange changes in her behavior in recent months. At first, she became sort of enthusiastic, said Maggie, a cashier who worked with Linda. It was like she was in love. And then all of a sudden she was quiet, scared, wore long-sleeved clothes more often, even in the heat. Bruises? Russell guessed. Maggie nodded. I saw a bruise on her wrist once, when her sleeve was rolled up. Asked what happened, and she just said she deserved it. I offered to help, but she refused. At Black Hill Prison, where Jack worked, the detective learned that the warden had been irritable and aggressive in recent weeks. He's always been strict but fair, said the shift supervisor, but lately something has changed a lot. He's even missed a few shifts, which is not like him at all. When exactly did this change start? Russell asked. The supervisor hesitated. About 3 weeks ago, maybe a little more. He became withdrawn, aggressive. He was especially strange with one of the prisoners, Vince Carter. He used to treat him like everybody else, and then suddenly he started being really strict, picking on little things. Who is this Carter? Russell asked. He's an inmate doing time for drug trafficking. Works in the utility block, including the visitor's room. The detective remembered the name found on the back of the lab results. Vince Carter. What connection could there be between him, the warden, and his wife? Russell decided it was time to talk to this inmate. Vince Carter hadn't looked troubled when he'd been brought in for questioning. A 30-year-old man with good looks and a cheeky smile, he held himself as if he were doing him a favor by agreeing to talk. What do you want to know about, detective? He asked with a chuckle. About the weather or the prison food? Linda Donovan, Russell answered bluntly. Carter's smile faltered, but quickly returned. What about her? He asked, clearly trying to look disinterested. Her husband was killed, and she disappeared, Russell said, watching the prisoner's reaction carefully. And somehow your name ended up on the back of her medical report, about her positive HIV status. Carter's complexion changed. He clearly hadn't expected such a turn. Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. Come on, Carter. You were having an affair with the warden's wife. How did it happen? Where did you meet? Vince was silent for a few seconds, weighing his options. Mrs. Donovan sometimes came to visit her husband, he said at last. I worked in the visitor's room. We got to talking. And you went from talking to something more? Russell nudged him. Carter shrugged with feigned indifference. She was unhappy. Her husband wasn't the nicest man. And you decided to comfort her? You could say that. Knowing you're HIV positive? Russell asked coldly. This time Carter could not hide his surprise. How did you? We have access to the prisoner's medical records, said the detective. You were diagnosed with HIV 2 months ago, before your meetings with Linda Donovan. Vince was silent, realizing that his lie had been exposed. It's not a crime, he finally said. She was a grown woman, she knew the risks. No, she didn't, Russell countered. You didn't tell her. And when she became infected and found out, you simply cut off contact, didn't you? Carter didn't answer, but his silence was more eloquent than any words. What happened next? The detective continued. Did Jack Donovan find out about his wife's affair? Her diagnosis? I have no idea, Vince snapped. I haven't spoken to Linda in weeks. And before that, how often did you see each other? Where? Carter was silent again, but Russell could see that his contrived confidence was fraying at the seams. A few times when I was working on the outside, he finally admitted. I had certain arrangements with one of the guards. Nothing serious, just a couple hours of freedom in exchange for a cut of the smuggled cigarettes. And where did you meet Linda? In an abandoned warehouse near the prison. Last time was about 2 months ago. Russell wrote this information down, mentally connecting the dots. The picture was slowly becoming clearer. Do you know where Linda is now? He asked. No, Vince answered, and for the first time in the whole interview, the detective believed him. She hasn't been in contact with me since she found out about my status. How did she find out? I didn't tell her. Carter lied again, but gave up under the detective's cold stare. Okay, she came to me when she got her results. She was, upset, blamed me. I told her I didn't know my status. She didn't believe me. She was right too, Russell said. You knew and deliberately put her at risk, and now her husband is dead and she's on the run. You're indirectly responsible for all of this, Carter. On the third day of the investigation came a message. Donovan's old Chevy was found in the parking lot of the Pine Forest Motel, 50 miles from Riverside. Russell drove there immediately. The motel manager recognized Linda from a photograph. She checked in the day before yesterday, about 6 a.m., he said. She looked awful, pale, with a cut on her cheek. Paid cash, didn't show a credit card or ID. Is she still here? Russell asked. Room 14. Hasn't come out since this morning. The detective went to the designated door and knocked gently. Mrs. Donovan? This is Detective Russell, Riverside Police Department. I need to speak with you. Silence. He knocked again, louder. Linda, I know you're in there. Let's talk. I'm not here to arrest you. I want to hear your side of the story. There was a long silence, then a faint rustling outside the door. Finally, the lock clicked and the door opened. Linda looked exhausted. Pale, tear-stained eyes, a cut on her cheek. I killed him, she said without preamble. My husband. Russell nodded, trying to look calm. May I come in? We need to talk. Linda stepped back, allowing him to enter the room. The room was modest and impersonal, like all roadside motels. Crumpled linens on the bed, an untouched tray of food on the table. Tell me what happened that night, Russell said softly, pulling out a notebook. Linda sat on the edge of the bed with her hands folded in her lap. Her gaze was blank, her voice monotonous, as if she were reciting a memorized text. I recently found out I have HIV, she began. From Vince Carter, the inmate with whom I had an affair with. Jack didn't know about him or my diagnosis. He found the test results that night. He was drunk, furious. I confessed everything. She touched the cut on her cheek. He hit me, first with his fist, then he smashed an ashtray on me. When I tried to run away, he grabbed my hair. I felt that he wouldn't stop, that he would kill me. In desperation, I grabbed the knife off the table. I just wanted him to let me go. I didn't think that... Her voice shook and she stopped talking. Russell waited patiently, not pushing her. Then it was just fear, she continued more quietly. I saw him fall, the blood spreading. I don't remember how I ran out of the house, how I got into the car. I woke up here at the motel. The detective made notes in his notebook. The story matched the evidence found at the crime scene. Why didn't you call the police? He asked. Didn't call an ambulance? Linda looked at him like he was crazy. I killed a man, she whispered. Her husband. All I could think about was running away. You were defending yourself, Mrs. Donovan, Russell said. All the evidence points to that. The signs of a struggle, your injuries, your husband's history of violent behavior as told by neighbors and co-workers. She shook her head, not accepting his words. It's my fault, she said. If it hadn't been for Vince, Jack would still be alive. Russell sighed. Typical domestic violence victim's guilt, compounded by the tragic outcome. I need to take you back to Riverside, he said softly. You need to make an official statement, but I promise you, we'll treat this as a case of self-defense. Linda nodded blankly, as if she didn't care anymore. What's going to happen to Vince? She asked quietly. We're considering charging him with willfully spreading HIV, Russell answered. That's a serious offense in our state. Something like satisfaction flashed in Linda's eyes, but it quickly faded, replaced by a familiar emptiness. It's been 2 weeks since the murder. The district attorney, a gray-haired woman with shrewd eyes, scrutinized the materials Russell had provided. The situation is quite clear, she said finally. Mrs. Donovan acted in self-defense. All the evidence supports her version. The signs of a struggle, the injuries on her face, the history of violence witnessed by neighbors and co-workers. I'm not pressing charges. What about Carter? The detective asked. He will be charged with willfully spreading HIV, the prosecutor replied. That's a serious offense in our state. Given his prior convictions, he'll get the maximum sentence. Russell nodded, satisfied with the decision. Mrs. Donovan will need serious psychological help, he remarked, and medical treatment. Social services will take care of that, the prosecutor assured him, although no amount of help can fully heal such trauma. Russell met with Linda one last time before closing the case. After 2 weeks of psychological counseling and the start of treatment, she looked a little better, with a glimmer of life in her eyes, though her overall expression was still depressed. "The charges have been dropped, Mrs. Donovan," the detective said. "The prosecutor ruled your actions were self-defense. Your case is closed." Linda nodded, but without much joy. "And Vince?" she asked. "He's facing additional time for willfully spreading HIV," Russell answered. Given his past, he wasn't likely to get out in the next few years. Linda lowered her eyes, and the detective saw in that gesture everything he needed to know. Despite the betrayal, a part of her was still attached to the man who had ruined her life. "He manipulated you, Mrs. Donovan," Russell said softly. "Exploited your vulnerability, your need for love and attention. People like him are experts at that." "I know," she replied quietly. "I know in my head, but the heart, it doesn't always listen to reason." "You'll need help," the detective said, pointing to the psychologist's business card she was already holding. "This isn't the end of life, although it may seem that way now." Linda smiled weakly. "Thank you, detective, for everything." "Just get well, Mrs. Donovan. That's the best kind of gratitude." That evening, after the case was closed, Russell sat in his car in front of the police station. Tiredness came in waves, but he couldn't sleep. In front of his eyes was Linda's face, a woman victimized by her own need for love and the cruel manipulator who had taken advantage of that need. He thought about how often in his work he had seen the desire for love, this supposedly beautiful human emotion, become the cause of the worst tragedies. Women and men desperately seeking emotional connection were victimized by those who saw them only as a means to fulfill their own needs. The Donovan case weaved together all the elements of the human drama: dissatisfaction with marriage, seeking solace on the side, manipulation, betrayal, and ultimately violence and death. Russell started the car and drove home. The workday was over, but the aftertaste of this case would haunt him for a long time to come. As would the thought that even the worst crimes begin with such ordinary human emotions: loneliness, the desire to be loved, the fear of being alone. And that sometimes crimes are committed not only by people, but also by circumstances that push them onto a path from which there is no return.